Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series Reflections in Time was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus, and I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960 and served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. We are here in the studios of KYNE Television on a bright October day. The year is 2004, and my guest is Dr. Kent Kirwan, who was retired now, but a former member of the Political Science Department, former chair of that department. And Kent, we're really pleased to have you here this afternoon.
Thank you.
We're going to find out some things about you and about your experiences here at UNO. And I guess it's time to begin. Let's talk about you to begin with. We're, you know, I know a lot about you, but I don't think we ever talked much about where you grew up. And
I was born in Albany, New York, your territory. I think you're from Schenectady.
I'm from Schenectady, so we came from 15 miles away from each other.
Exactly. And I lived there until I was in the 3rd grade, and then my mother became head of public relations for the National Safety Council in Chicago. So we moved to the north side of Chicago, where we lived until I completed grade school. And then my mother got the job as public relations head of the Bureau of Traffic for the city of Washington, D.C. And my brother and I were sent to a Southern Baptist Military Academy in the woods in Virginia, not too far from Charlottesville. And since there wasn't a great deal to do outside of military things, I began to love school for the first time in my life. Did fairly well and got a 4-year scholarship to the College of William and Mary upon completion of my high school times.
Well, that's quite a distinguished undergraduate institution.
I really loved it. It was the first time I'd been to school with girls. And they had an excellent political science department. It was called government there rather than political science. I waited tables. I was there when Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe had their honeymoon, and had the privilege of serving them in a restaurant. King's Arms, the name of it, and along with a lot of other celebrities, because Williamsburg is quite a tourist spot.
Yes, indeed.
And so I just had a wonderful 4 years there.
Well, and that was kind of a lesson in history at the same time.
Oh, yes. I really developed a love of colonial history especially, and toward the end of my career I began doing some research on George Washington, and it was such a pleasure because I knew a great deal about the environs in which he grew up and served in the Virginia legislature, and so it was really fun.
Yeah, I bet it was. Well, what then? You graduated?
Well, I graduated in 1954, and I received a commission as a 2nd lieutenant in the artillery, Army Artillery, and then shortly after graduation I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for my basic training, where I boxed in the Olympics. Billy Vessels, who was a All-American tailback at Oklahoma, was my corner man. Yeah. I didn't do very well, to be completely honest with you. But then, shortly thereafter, when I finished my basic training, I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, went through jump school and became a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division, and stayed there for about 2 years.
That must have been a bit of a challenge.
It was. Jump school is one of the hardest experiences I've ever been through. The very first day of qualifying, we had to run 10 miles. and I was about to pass out when a great big black arm came and lifted me up. And that young man turned out to be my driver later on, and we became close friends. But thanks to him, I was able to finish that 10-mile run and thereafter get through jump school. But it was physically very challenging, and we learned judo, and we did all kinds of maneuvers and jumps, and but I enjoyed every minute of it.
So you were, for the rest of your term in the Army, then you were stationed at Fort Bragg?
I was stationed at Fort Bragg. We did take trips. We went to Thule, Greenland at one point, and I thought I was going to get to go to Korea, but they took us to Camp Drake, Tokyo, and by that time the peace negotiations had reached the point where we were no longer necessary, and so they sent us back home. So I never did see combat in the Korean War, though I wanted to, but I didn't.
You didn't have any thought of making the military a career?
When it came time for me to get out, I had a very persuasive company commander who said you ought to make a career of it, and I was offered an opportunity to spend some time in Germany, which was really attractive. But when I looked at things in the long view, I stuck to my original plan to go to graduate school. And so I went to the University of Chicago for my MA and PhD. I had a mentor at William & Mary who kept in touch with me while I was in the military and sent me reading lists and did various things to keep me on track. And
well, what stimulated your interest in political science to begin with?
At William & Mary, you had to choose a major at the end of your sophomore year. You couldn't choose it before, and you couldn't choose it after. So your first 2 years were very few electives, mostly required courses. And a fraternity brother sat me down on the edge of my bed in my dormitory room one day and said, in choosing a major, you ought to pick something you really care about. And what kinds of things do you really enjoy talking about? And I said, politics and philosophy. So he said, well, you can go into the political science department or government department and do political philosophy, which is a major field, or you can go in the philosophy department and do the same kind of thing there. As it turned out, William & Mary had a very distinguished government department, but a very small philosophy department, and so I was attracted to the government department, where I had a wonderful time and took various courses which deepened my interest.
Well, it sounds as though you were fortunate in running into that fraternity brother who gave you such good advice.
Yes, I was. He fought in the Korean War. He went in before I did and was shot down over Korea. So, but he was a very close friend, and I knew a lot of people in those days who lost their lives in that war. So that war meant something to me that's hard to.
Yeah, we tend to forget
history.
about it these days. It's not exactly a completely forgotten war, but it's not an emphasized one.
But I knew a lot of people who were in the service and who lost their lives, and so it meant a great deal to me.
Yeah, my brother was in the Marine Corps in Korea, so I've been to Korea, spent some.
I'd like to go sometime. My colleague in the political science department, Dr. Chung, has been threatening to take me, and because he's a native of Korea, I'd really love to go.
It's a beautiful country, and I recommend it.
Okay.
Especially if you have such a good guide as Chung Chan.
Right.
Okay, well, let's get back to your education. You're in Chicago now.
Right.
University.
Was, as soon as I got on campus, I was offered the position of dormitory head, which was wonderful because it took care of my room and board. So I was housed and fed without having to pay anything. And so I became the head of a dormitory and completed my master's degree. Took me a while to get through my thesis, but the professor who was in charge of my thesis said, I'm retiring in 3 months. I want it on my desk.
That's pretty good motivation.
Yes, it was good motivation. And I also, I married my wife there, and I always felt that I had to bring something to the table, to her mother especially, to say, so I wanted to have that master's degree in hand when I proposed marriage, so that I could show her mother that I had some prospects. And then, upon completing the master's degree, I became assistant director of student activities. It was a job where you were sort of a liaison between student organizations and the university. So I oversaw the newspaper and fraternities and various student organizations, and I did that for about a year. And then my wife persuaded me to quit and go to undertake the PhD program full-time, and I did. And she worked very hard and put me through those first 2 years of classes. And then I put her through the remainder of her degree program, and we left Chicago in '66. Before I'd gotten my PhD, I had an offer as a visiting professor of political science at Lawrence College in Appleton, Wisconsin, which is about 30 miles from Green Bay. And I was there when the Packers won their first 2 Super Bowls, and so it was a fun place.
You participated in the celebration?
Well, one of the members of the team, a guard named Fussy Thurston, had a bar there called the Left Guard, and we would meet Packer football players down there late in the afternoon. So it was a fun place to live.
I'll bet it was.
I was also very fortunate.
It's pretty up there, too.
Oh, it's the Fox River Valley,
right,
and it is beautiful. At that time, I received the Kent Fellowship from the Danforth Foundation, which was...
that somehow seems appropriate,
Oh,
Kent.
yes. But it gave me a tremendous amount of money, which at that time, first year teaching, I was making $8,000 a year. But I thought that was a great deal of money. And but this gave me a great deal more than that and allowed me to take a complete year off and complete my dissertation. And I did that, and during that same year, I interviewed for some jobs and decided to accept a position at Marquette University in Milwaukee, which was about 100 miles down from Appleton. Spent 8 very nice years there, and then decided to come to UNO.
So what was there a big change from Appleton to Milwaukee? Well, there's difference in the size of the cities. But
Milwaukee is big, and we lived 2 blocks from Lake Michigan, which was a beautiful place to live. We lived right near the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and I had many good friends who taught there. Marquette, like Creighton University, here it was a downtown university, and UWM was sort of like UNO here, sort of in the nicer parts of town, so to speak. So I really enjoyed teaching there. The students were great, but a lot of my friends on the faculty began to leave and go other places, and the life in the department wasn't as pleasant as it had been originally. And so I heard of the opening at UNO. In particular, Herb Garfinkel, who was our Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs, he had co-authored a textbook.
Vice Chancellor here at UNO.
Vice Chancellor here at UNO. He had co-authored a textbook on American government, and to this day, I think it's the best textbook on American government ever written. And I used that textbook and learned a great deal from it. It was co-authored with Martin Diamond, and so I'd heard of him, and then I heard about this position and was lucky enough to be chosen to come here as chair and associate professor. So I came in the fall of '77.
Well, I'm very familiar with that process you were just describing.
You picked me up at the airport in your truck and took me all over Omaha and gave me a delightful dinner, so that started me off on the right foot.
And I think Herb had something to do with it before then, because he had written to friends of his to find out if they knew of any student or any former students or others that they'd met who might be interested in a position, and we were looking for a department chair, and that's not an easy thing to recruit for sometimes.
Right. I had been an assistant chair at Marquette. But it wasn't a very challenging position because we had a priest who really took care of just about everything.
Right. Well, did you find it much of a transition from a small institution?
Well, Marquette is the largest Catholic university in the United States.
No, I don't mean from there to here, but I mean from Appleton to Milwaukee. It was a fairly small institution in Appleton.
I had always, when I went to Lawrence, it was a dream. I had always in my mind's eye wanted to teach at a small liberal arts college. Right. Lawrence was that. It's a small campus. It was about 2,000. and it was a beautiful part of the country. It was very cold. One winter it got down to 55 below zero. But it was my first job, and we were just having, we had our first child in Milwaukee, or Chicago, and our second child in Appleton. So we were sort of settling in, and it was an exciting time. But having gone to Marquette from Lawrence, I appreciated the advantages of a large university versus a small college, and I saw teaching in a large university as a very, pleasant and advantageous thing. So,
well, I think that most of us, like you and myself, that went to small liberal arts colleges themselves.
When I went to William & Mary, it was about 2,000 people.
Right, always have that idea, gee, it'd be nice to teach in a place like this. I never did, but you had that opportunity. I envy you that. So you, as I said, I was instrumental in bringing you here. I should tell you that Herb Garfinkel thought very highly of you. Not only did you think highly of him, but
I did think highly of him.
But he thought very highly of you, and
he
was pleased
very good to me after I came and kept in touch.
He was pleased when we were able to recruit you here, and talk about learning. You learned from his book. I never walked into his office without learning something. He was just a born teacher, and I learned more about James Madison and about the U.S. Constitution from Herb than I ever thought I'd learn.
Herb was head of James Madison College at Michigan State.
In fact, I think he probably had something to do with naming it.
Wouldn't surprise me.
Right. So then you came to UNO, and tell me about your first impressions of this campus.
I thought the campus was beautiful. It reminded me a little bit of William & Mary because it has a colonial feel to it because of the architecture, especially Arts and Sciences Hall, which looked like it could be on the campus of the College of William & Mary. And it was a small campus, which I also appreciated.
Much smaller back then than it is now.
Yes, that's true. Because when I came here, there was no, the Science Hall, the Durham Science Hall was not there. Fine Arts Building was not there. None of the dormitories or anything like that. So the campus has probably just about doubled in size since 77, the fall of 77 when I came here. Coming here too, I was lucky enough to, my first semester as chair, President Gerald Ford visited campus, and I had the very pleasant duty of, he was visiting professor of political science, I think, for a day.
This was after his...
after the election that he lost, but I found him an extraordinarily charming person, and the stereotype that Chevy Chase had built up about him being very clumsy was really, or awkward, complete falsehood, because he could handle himself beautifully, and I enjoyed meeting him and spending that day with him. It was just a great deal of fun.
Yeah, so there were several quotes from Lyndon Johnson, I think, that about how he played football too long without a helmet.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't think so. He was a pretty smart fellow.
Yeah, he was.
And, I had my father's cousin was Mike Kirwan, who served in the Congress from Ohio, and he knew him very well, and so that created a bridge between us. And so he knew from Mike, he knew sort of where my family came from.
Ohio and Michigan there.
Yeah, right.
And of course, you'd been in Michigan.
Yes.
Well, yeah, right. Wisconsin, I was thinking.
Right.
But, yeah, I always mix up that. When you think, I was obviously thinking of Marquette University, and then I always mix that up, thinking of Marquette, Michigan, and then Marquette University in Wisconsin.
One of the ties between Marquette University and UNO is that the great big field house at Marquette University when I taught there. You walked in the front door and you saw this gigantic picture of this halfback who was an All-American at Marquette. And I was walking across the UNO campus, and I saw this person, and it was Don Leahy.
Don Leahy, right.
And I stopped him right in his tracks. He must have thought I was an absolute idiot. But I said, I know you, and of course I didn't know him, but I told him about the big picture and the field house at Marquette. And we've been sort of friends ever since.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of others. Hugh Cowden.
Hugh's a good friend, and he lived in the house next door to the house that I lived in. And these two houses were exact opposites of each other. In other words, they were built by the same people at the same time, but the design of the rooms or everything were the exact opposite. And so, Hugh and I have been good friends ever since I've come here.
Hugh, of course, was chairman of the journalism and later the communication department for many years. Yeah. So there are some it's a small world, I
yes,
guess.
It is indeed.
Right. What was, we've talked about what the campus was like physically. What was the curriculum like back then? Was it?
Well, you had once said to me, I think, and I hope I'm quoting you correctly, something to the effect that when a lot of the changes that were taking place across the country in responses to some of the things that had arisen in the 60s, we had maintained a classical curriculum. And I really agreed with that 100%. But I was the chair of a curricular review committee that went from 1978 to 1981. Hugh Cowden was on that committee, among others, and we hopefully maintained but strengthened in particulars the degree requirements. And it's interesting that down through the years, when I receive compliments for things that I did from people like Hugh Cowden and Reese Connor and Gordon Mundell, they always bring up that that committee and the successes that was able to have. So I've always considered that as a very, if I've made a contribution to the curriculum, that was it, mostly.
Now, was that, I'm trying to recall, was that a college or a university-wide?
It was college.
Okay.
Yeah, arts and sciences.
Because we had a university-wide one, too, not so long after.
And I participated in that as a member of that committee because of my experience with the College of Arts and Sciences Committee under Otto Bauer.
Right. And Otto worked long and hard at that
yes,
to get
he did.
some standardization of the curricula in the various colleges, and I hope that we had a major effect.
I think we had an input.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned several people there, all of whom were distinguished professors at the time in, in various departments.
Very pleasant group to work with.
Right.
I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, well, I think everyone appreciated the work that you put into it. That was not a turning point because we were already pretty good, but it was
it was refining a basically
really was
sound
an
curriculum.
Important contribution, and I think that's...
Also during those years, one of my responsibilities was the pre-law advisor under a committee that you established, and with Gordon, oh my gracious, you're a dean, you're
Hansen.
Gordon Hansen.
Right.
And I had every year at my home a colloquium on law, and I had a lot of law professors from Creighton and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, but I had people like Bob Spire and Nick Caparelli, who served on the Nebraska Supreme Court.
Right.
And in addition to all of the technical information about how to get in and stay in law school and how to get jobs, people like Bob and Nick talked about the law in a broader, more philosophic perspective.
And Bob Spire, of course,
Bob Spire
was a very distinguished attorney who...
Attorney General of Nebraska, too.
Attorney General of Nebraska, finally, and who also had been a regent of Omaha University back in the days when it was a municipal university.
I came to know him through Professor Orv Menard, and Bob drew up my will and did a number of... He was the head of Ellick, Spire & Jones, which is a law firm downtown. But
yeah, I knew Bob very well. Unfortunately, he's deceased now.
Right. I went to that memorial service and sat with Ernie Chambers during that memorial service. But Bob and Nick, too. Nick's daughter, Laura, was a student at UNO, and they lived about a block away from me before, this was before Nick got elevated to the Nebraska Supreme Court.
Well, I knew Nick very well, too, because one of his passions was teaching.
Yes.
He really enjoyed it. And he always taught business law for the...
I remember that.
And he'd come in at 7 o'clock in the morning and teach that course before he went to work as a district court judge.
I remember that. I do.
Earlier than that, before his regular part of his legal career.
Right.
And I took that course from him.
Oh, you did?
And
I wish I had.
Oh, it was wonderful. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah.
He was a fine teacher. Well, let's see. We got off the track there, Kent, but let's get back on it. We're talking about the curriculum in your department. What was that like back then?
Well, it was very, very traditional. Political science is basically divided into 4 areas: political philosophy, American government, international relations, and comparative politics. And we were quite strong, I think, in both international and comparative. And then later on, I took over the political philosophy after one of our professors retired, and Dr. Bykirk, who had strength in that area, came on board, and then we had a number of people, and I also did all the constitutional law, so that was in addition to the American government offering. And Dr. Kalasa did the presidency in Congress, and Dr. Johnson did Nebraska politics and things like that, plus methodology. And so I think for the size of our department, we were always about 8 people. We gave our students
covered the ground pretty
well.
Yeah. Now, for the benefit of those listeners who don't have the advantage of a political science background, could you give me you spoke of those 4 areas in political science. Could you give me a one-sentence description of each of those?
Political philosophy studies the question of what is man, how should he live, the question of the best regime, all the way from Plato to Nietzsche. And American government looks at the president, primarily focusing on the national government, looks at presidency, Congress, the courts, public administration to some extent, though that has now got a separate department to look at that.
In a minute.
And then, to a degree, we did local politics. Both Dr. Kalasa and Dr. Johnson had expertise there. In comparative government, the idea is to compare various governments and their constitutions and their ways of life. Dr. Menard was really our star in that area, and he also had a specialty in French politics. Dr. Farr, who taught with us for a while but later became an administrator, he had a strength in British politics. Dr. Chung does to this day do Asian politics, and the new people that have, Dr. Menard is now retired, but a young woman, Jody Nethery Castro, has taken his place, and her interest too is French politics, and she has a passion for that. And international politics is very much akin to comparative politics, and it looks at the foreign policies of different governments throughout the world and how they interact with each other, and the United Nations, and just the global scene, and its significance for the ways we all live our lives.
If I remember, you mentioned Dr. Farr, who then became Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, but he had some interests in Russian government too, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And Dr. Bacon did that during my tenure. I did not teach with John. John became an administrator early before I came, but we became friends, and I learned a great deal about what he did from just conversations with him.
Okay. Now let's, you did mention a moment ago, and I said we'd get back to it, you mentioned public administration. That's one of the areas in which you taught a little, isn't it?
I did. I did my doctoral dissertation. It was sort of a cross between political philosophy and public administration. Woodrow Wilson had written an article called The Study of Administration, which is understood as the founding article that created the discipline. And I did my doctoral dissertation on analyzing his arguments concerning the relationship between politics and administration. So,
yeah, that must have been interesting. Was it just before or just after you arrived on the scene here in Omaha that public administration moved from the political science department?
It was just before I came.
Then it became part of the College of Public Affairs and Community Service.
And I forget the name of the gentleman who became the first chair, but he had been a major teacher in our poli-sci department.
Terrible, I can't remember it either, but that's one of the things when you when you start getting a little gray hair.
Harry Reynolds, of course, was one of the public administration, and Harry and I had a good relationship, and in fact we published some stuff together, and I still see Harry every now and then. He's still getting along pretty good.
Well, now you knew these people and you worked with them, but did that make much difference in the department at the time when this kind of major area of political science split off?
It did, from my way of looking at things, because it had been a main part of the American government curriculum at Marquette, where I had taught. That's where I taught public administration. So I sort of missed it. But on the other hand, to have a whole department doing that, and throughout my tenure here, we've had good relations with the people, some excellent people over there, and so I think from the university's perspective, it's been a very good, well, it's good that they split off and became a department on their own. It strengthened our overall offering at the university. So
now, trying to remember, going back that far, there was, of course, interpersonal cross-fertilization here but was there any exchange of courses and this sort of thing? Did you
Dr. Johnson taught a course that was mostly methodology that was taken by both public administration and political science students. So that was our primary curricular.
But they didn't ask you, well, would you like to teach a course for CPACs or something?
No, we didn't do, except for Dr. Johnson, we did not do any of that. They took all the public. I had taught a course on the American bureaucracy at Marquette and the study of public administration, but they had people doing that, I guess, over there, so they didn't need any of my contribution.
Well, that was an interesting development. We had a number of split-offs at that time. Many of them were with that college. For example, in sociology, had the criminal justice program, and that became one of the major departments in College of Public Affairs.
The split off of public administration from political science has been controversial nationally. That is to say, the premise of the split was the idea that administration could stand alone, sort of divorced from politics, and that, of course, was the subject of my dissertation, whether or not there is this dichotomy between politics and administration. So that controversy was manifested institutionally by the creation of two separate academic, pursuits. So,
well, is part of the argument that you're teaching an applied discipline rather than a theoretical one?
The idea of public administration, that it could stand alone, really comes from Max Weber's works that looks at administration primarily as applied, and the other side of the argument is that what is applied is influenced by the political framework within which it exists, and that you can't really separate the two, how work is done from why work is done, or the purposes for which work is done.
Well, our audience is getting a little education here in some of the aspects of political science. That's good. Let's see. We've talked about the curriculum in the department and in the university. You've mentioned some of the faculty and what their specialties were. The real old-timer in the department was a gentleman who you and I both remember. And I'm trying to recall.
Bill Utley?
No, Bill Utley was certainly one of them. I was thinking of Breck Lambert.
Oh, Breck Lambert, yeah.
But those two were the key, were the backbone of the political science department when I first came here in 1960. And they were both, well, Utley had become a dean, I guess.
Bill was over in continuing studies.
Right. And so you didn't interact with him a great deal, I presume.
We didn't interact so much professionally as we did personally, because he maintained an interest in our department, and he and his wife, when we first came here, were very kind to us, and we appreciated it.
Yeah, he was kind to me, too.
Yes.
I think he was that kind of person.
Yes, he was.
He took younger
Very nice.
faculty under his wing and told you what the best stores to shop in were. And
yes, and his wife had a collection of furniture, as I recall, and they moved to New England, and she maintained that interest, and I think Bill got involved in local politics up there.
Yeah. Well, he was involved in the development of the Omaha governing charter, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. I don't know too much about that in detail, but I know that he played a considerable part.
Yeah, so we're talking about now we were talking about the applied and the theoretical.
Yeah.
You can do both.
Yes, you can. Very much so.
Yeah. And Dr. Lambert, what did he teach? I was trying to
He taught
recall.
political theory.
Okay.
And when he retired, I took over those courses. And he retired to Mobile, Alabama, and I forget exactly when that was, but it was right around the time that I stopped being chair. Like 1986 or something along those lines. I forget which, but so the department has maintained its integrity or in its character sort of from that time forward. And we've been an extraordinarily happy bunch, I guess you'd say.
Good.
We still, to this, even though a lot of us have been retired, Dr. Camp is retired, Dr. Menard, we still...
And all of them have been interviewed in this series, by the way. So,
and we have all maintained strong relationships, and we have departmental parties still, which we all still attend, even though we're retired. So we've maintained ourselves as a very happy department.
We were talking a little while ago, and we kind of got off the subject on something else, but we were talking about one of what I consider to be your major contributions to the college, and that was the pre-law curriculum.
Yeah.
And I attended some of those seminars that you had at your house, and before that, pre-law was pretty much the bailiwick of the history department. And when let's see, who was it? When Dr. Trickett retired, and Dr. Paul.
Oh, I know who you mean.
One of our finest history teachers.
Yes, I didn't know him. He and I.
But he had been a pre-law advisor too. And the name will come to me. Why? It's terrible when you can't remember these things, because I can see his face. I knew him very, very well.
And or have worshipped him.
Yes, yes.
Jerry Simmons was going to be sort of a partner with me, apparently, in this, but Jerry lost interest in it, and so I ended up doing it more or less on my own. But
just so long, just to let our listening audience know, the pre-law curriculum is not a major in the college.
No, and law schools don't want a pre-law major.
Right.
They want people to have a broad liberal arts requirement with strengths in English and history, as well as government courses that are relevant. And but they want some people who are broad in complex, theoretically complex disciplines. Economics would be another, psychology, sociology, these kinds of things. They want people to really have breadth as well as depth.
And I should mention that our first thought is always for our students.
Yes.
And so we look at what those professional schools, whether it's law or medicine or anything else, in their pre-professional programs, we look at what they want, what they say they want to have. Sometimes they even specify courses. In medicine particularly, you know, you need chemistry and some of the other things.
And I went to all the pre-law conference meetings. I belonged to our university belonged to the Western group, which included just about everybody west of the Missouri. And we usually met in Denver once a year and discussed everything about pre-law curriculum, and it was a good experience. Plus, every 5 years they had a national conference in San Diego, New Orleans, and I went to those, and it was very. No,
I think our listeners are getting the idea that we take these things very seriously.
Yes.
And
another
we
thing
do our best for the students, and that they can count on us when it comes to helping to get admitted to these schools.
One of the things that the students enjoyed most is that we had a mock trial team. For 7 years we participated in the national tournament, and in the third year in which we participated, we won 3rd place. This is out of about 100 universities competing. But what really made me proud is that we won the most professional team trophy, which is all your competitors vote for those people they compete against who are most ethical, and we won, which was the biggest trophy given by the Mock Trial Association. We won this huge trophy for most professional, and that really made me very proud.
That is something to be proud of.
We did that for 7 years, and we were quite successful for quite some time, and it was not just myself, but my former students who had gone on to become lawyers, who helped train our students, and so it was a wonderful experience.
What's the current status of the pre-law?
I think my successor, Dr. Carson Holloway, is trying to sort of revive a pre-law club, out of which perhaps may arise a mock trial team, because the mock trial championships are still going strong, and they're at Drake University in Des Moines. And when it was starting out, I was on the board that helped sort of mold that, and so it was a wonderful experience for me. And but it's a big deal, and now probably close to 300 universities from all over the country compete every year at Drake University, and plus there are regional tournaments, so it's grown to be quite an enterprise.
Well, I wanted to be sure that we talked at some length about this, because I know that it was something you cared about and something you spent a great deal of time on.
We did all our training during Christmas vacation.
Right. So and I also know that you had some great students graduate from that.
We did, and a lot of them went on, are very successful to this day. And some of them are still here in town, and I get to see them, and in fact use them every now and then when I have legal questions. I can pick up the phone and call a number of people.
It does help, doesn't it?
It really does.
You taught in a couple of different areas. Which one did you like the best?
Well, political philosophy was my favorite area, and the area of political philosophy that I most enjoyed was classical or ancient. And my favorite course was the one that included Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. But on the other side of the fence, I taught a course on the founding, in which we read the Federalist Papers. And if I had to pick 1 or 2 books to be on a desert island with, they would be Plato's Republic and the Federalist Papers. So most constitutional law curriculums across the country only I have 2 courses, and the first one is called the Federal System, which talks about the executive and the legislature and the judicial branches and the law that comes out of those. And the second one has to do with civil liberties, and but no one, until I came here, I began with sort of an introduction to constitutional law by studying the philosophy of the founders and the making of the Constitution, and then the next course had to do with the Supreme Court cases, etc. But if you know about how the Constitution was put together and the thought of the Founding Fathers, then the decisions of the Marshall Court make a great deal more sense to you than they otherwise would. And of course the Marshall Court went for 37 years, so The influence of the founding really was extended through the Marshall Court right up until modern times.
You're talking about John Marshall,
yes,
of course.
John Marshall.
That,
our first and greatest Chief Justice. Well, not our first, but our greatest.
That's fascinating stuff. I sometimes wish I'd studied it more. But, well, I guess it's not too late for me.
No,
I
it's
can
not.
Go back and
one of the nice things about retirement is the opportunity to read
Yeah.
things that you missed.
Let's talk a little bit about your research. We talk about traditionally the role of the professor being teaching and research, and
I've
various
always
sorts
thought of the
service.
two as going hand in hand. And I've enjoyed research, though I've mostly published articles in journals, depending on what I'm interested in, and I began publishing things on Woodrow Wilson, and then I was led this way or that way, and so I have sort of an eclectic number of articles. Most recently, I've done an article with a colleague, a new young colleague in our department, Randall Atkins. We did it on the Electoral College, and and before that, I published a chapter in a book on George Washington. And for a number of years, I've been really reading Washington's papers and a lot of stuff about him. So I'd say I'm sort of schizophrenic. I've had this interest in American politics, especially at the more theoretical level of law and American political thought. Plus, at the same time, I've had a pretty good grounding in political philosophy from Plato through Nietzsche. So
Washington's apparently a tremendously interesting character, right?
He was not well educated. He never went to school. But I don't think we've ever had a president before since who had such good judgment. He had this understanding of things, and he was a very dignified, sort of severe,
almost aloof.
Very much so. Though he had strong friendships, and he was the kind of general who was in the front lines. He never sat back at a table behind the front lines. He was up there on his horse, and people thought that he was miraculous because the bullets went through his clothing and knocked 4 or 5 horses from under him during various battles, but they never could kill him. And that's amazing because he was 6'4". He was the biggest person in the United States.
Really an athlete.
He was a fantastic athlete. He was very strong and he was very agile. He was a fantastic swimmer, and he was a magnificent man.
You know, I've got a first edition of Washington Irving's 4-volume set, Life.
I have that too. That's wonderful.
And
I'm now reading Cherno's new biography of Alexander Hamilton, which is the best biography of Hamilton I've ever seen. It is magnificent, and I highly recommend it. President Bush says that he's read that, so I heard him say that the other day. So,
well, that I won't say it. I was going to say that might answer some of his critics a bit.
That's true.
Okay, well, we're getting along in time here. But then there are a few other things I want to talk about, and I'm sure you want to talk about too. Well, we talked about your eclecticism in research. What area did you enjoy working in the most?
Political philosophy.
Political philosophy. Well, it's just as
this is why.
teaching.
When I was at William and Mary, I had a teacher who turned out to be my mentor, and he's still teaching in Northern Illinois now. But he sort of wet my whistle for this, taught me my first class in political philosophy, and he was the one who sent me to Chicago, so to speak, to study with this particular scholar, and so that's been my main thing. But I had the good fortune to study under Dr. Herman Pritchett at the University of Chicago, who was called the Dean of Constitutional Law after Edward Corwin, and so the two greatest figures in constitutional law. I've had the pleasure of, well, I went to Princeton to do my doctoral dissertation, and took a course from Corwin there and met Corwin, and so having had both he and Mr. Pritchett, I feel I've been really had the opportunity to study with the greatest people in the field, and two of the nicest human beings there ever were, too.
And that works two ways, because we were extremely fortunate to have you here bringing the knowledge and wisdom of these gentlemen right here to our campus in Omaha.
I really enjoyed it.
Let's talk a little bit about university service, that being the third of the triumvirate of teaching, research, and service. You were on many, many committees and had engaged in presentations both on campus and the community. I know you're on a faculty senate, and I also know and particularly appreciate your service on the standing committees of the college, because you know, with 20 years as dean, I couldn't have survived without those committees. They were really really great, and I appreciated the amount of time that people had to spend on it, especially the Dean's Advisory Committee that had to review every single action on reappointing faculty, granting tenure to faculty. Remember those days?
I do remember those days.
Tell me something about what you remember.
Well, I remember, as you say, that those are very difficult decisions to make, and that we reviewed the credentials of a great number of faculty. And it was a pleasure serving with you, because you certainly let us have our head and took our deliberations seriously, but then you made the decision, and we were very grateful for that.
Most of the time I agreed with you.
Most of the time, but there were times when we were wrong, perhaps, and you were right.
You were, what do you remember about the Faculty Senate? That's a little applied politics.
Well, one of the most interesting things about the Faculty Senate was Del Weber was our chancellor, and there had been some monkey business in choosing Excellence in Teaching Awards, and Del Weber asked me to form a committee to award the Excellence in Teaching annually, and so for 4 years I created and chaired for 4 years the committee that gives the Excellence in Teaching Awards, and the pleasure there was working directly with Chancellor Weber, who I think was, in my experience, is a model for a university chancellor. He was absolutely wonderful, I thought, and so that was the major thing that came out of my Faculty Senate experience, the opportunity to work with the chancellor on this particular enterprise.
I shouldn't let it go by without mentioning that you were also at one time a recipient of that.
I did, after, in fact, one of the strange things was that I was nominated, but because I served on the committee, I could not. So once I got off of the committee, I was nominated, and I eventually was
and that is, if you look at the list of people who received that, they are the truly great teachers.
Of all the things I've ever achieved, that is the thing I most treasure, because that's what I wanted to be when I grew up.
Well, tell me, since you were instrumental in at least revising the criteria that were used and so on, what does it take to become to receive that award?
Well, what we did is that we standardized procedure so that it would be the same every year, and we created lists of things that all nominees would submit to the committee. And so we ended up getting big notebooks from all those who were nominated. But we had a committee of about 7 or 8 people from all the colleges in the university who worked diligently. And I must say, really, I admired the hard work and the integrity of all the members of the committee to pick. And it was very difficult, because you have people from all over the university who are excellent in what they do, but those of us in one area may not be familiar with how tough it is to achieve in another area. So it was an education for us. But the people who received our awards, I think, went on to become pillars of the university in many respects. And
two things I should mention. One of them is that there is a little financial reward that goes along with that.
Yes, it was $1,000
Right.
when I got it, but I think it's probably been raised.
Yeah. And secondly, the credit really for beginning that goes to Kirk Naylor. He was, well, I guess,
He was
trying to
just
remember
leaving.
whether the title was president or chancellor
Yeah.
back then. But he, and I don't know whether you know the story of his starting it, but
No, I don't.
when he received stipends for speaking, he put them in a kitty and said, "Let's use this to reward the great teachers."
Oh, that's wonderful.
And they originally called it the Great Teacher.
They did.
And
my colleague Orv Menard was one of the first
right,
recipients.
Right, and it's a great credit to Kirk Naylor that he did that.
Yes, when I first came here, I went to dinner at his home and met him, and of course, Ron Roskins was our president at that time,
Right.
so I had just missed Naylor's presidency.
Right.
Was he the president when we made the transition to become the University of Nebraska at Omaha? Because that was '68 or something like that, or you know more about that than I
Yeah,
do.
he was. Right. There was a good deal that happened then. That
Yeah.
was much of which was a bit unpleasant.
Oh, okay.
But it's been documented very well and been discussed in this forum and in others. So, yeah, we have about a minute left.
Okay.
And time goes by quickly.
Yeah.
But I want to be sure that we don't miss anything.
Yeah.
And one of the we've talked about a lot of people
Right.
who were influential in your life and in the life of the university. Is there anybody that we haven't mentioned that you think ought to be, like I just mentioned Kirk Naylor, do you think?
Well, I have enjoyed so much the members of the College of Arts and Sciences, the fellow faculty in all the departments, and especially the history department outside of my own. So, but I think that this university is blessed with some extraordinarily capable faculty.
I agree with you
And
completely.
it's hard to single out. There's so many good people. It's hard to single out any one to.
Well, I really thank you for being with us here this
Thank you.
afternoon. It's really been fun remembering all these different occasions. And for our audience, I want to thank you for joining us today in a visit with Dr. Kent Kirwan, longtime member of the Faculty of Political Science at UN Omaha. We've been taking a look at some of the history of the university as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton, inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.